On the 17th of March in 2018, the Chinese president is recorded here sitting with his back to his party delegates at the People's National Congress, about to undertake what was probably the most important action of his entire life. The red paper that he puts inside of this box is him voting to make himself China's first president for life. And I have to say, this is one of the few times that I've ever seen him looking genuinely happy. His vote is then followed by thousands of others, totaling at just over 3,000, with only 2 against and 4 abstentions. And with this, Xi Jinping takes total control of the Chinese government, for as long as he wants, at a congressional session where most had been expecting him to announce his successor. At the same Congress, Xi announces that China's development offers other countries a model for nations that want to speed up their development, and that it's time for China to take centre stage in the world and make a greater contribution to humankind. And the rest of the world was about to find out what this great contribution to humankind was going to be, because this was a lot more than just political theatre. In the 2 years since 2018, China has moved from being an authoritarian state that's mostly concerned with building internal stability, to one that's now actively exporting authoritarianism on the world stage. This includes a coordinated strategy on every front, including economic, technological, military. And just like the Soviet Union exported its political model providing military and economic assistance to other communist countries, Xi's China is using economic and technological aid to prop up and strengthen autocracies around the world. And in doing so, it's become one of the biggest barriers to the spread of democratic values. If liberal and democratic systems are to succeed, it's essential to understand the nature of this threat and how the Chinese authoritarian system has developed since the 1990s and how it operates today. In 1999, when Xi Jinping was just a provincial governor, 5 missiles were fired from US B-2 stealth bombers at what was supposed to be a Serbian arms trading outfit, but instead turned out to be the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. The NATO intervention against Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia had authorized US bombers to destroy Serbian military targets. The resulting explosions killed 3 Chinese nationals and injured several more. This was a diplomatic disaster that brought considerable tensions between the two countries, and China rejected the US government's explanation that the targeted sites were based on an outdated map, saying that the US's actions were nothing more than gunboat diplomacy. And tensions were made worse by a leaked report that said the embassy had been targeted because it was found providing electronic assistance to the Serbian military.
It's tragic, it's awful, but it's a tragedy, and it was an accident. What is barbaric is the intentional ethnic cleansing that he has provoked for a decade now.
Whether it was deliberate or not, the bombing caused mass protests among nationalists in China, with mounting pressure on President Jiang Zemin to respond with force. Instead, President Jiang responded that any military retaliation would only harm China's ability to build up state power. The foreign minister said, "We must not enter into frontal military conflict with the United States. Only when the country is prosperous and strong will we have the strength to back our words with actions." The Chinese government here was repeating a policy formulated by previous leaders that China should avoid the limelight on the world stage and keep a low profile, which was a lesson that had been learned after the many conflicts that Chairman Mao's leadership had brought the country into. China, just like the Soviet Union, had funded and armed communist revolutionary groups all over the world, providing support to armed insurgents in Thailand, Malaysia, India, Burma, Angola, and even the Congo. Maoist theories of a communist revolution led by peasants had inspired uprisings as far away as Peru and Palestine, and the chairman himself was only too happy to lend support. During the Cultural Revolution, the country adopted a much more aggressive foreign policy, starting conflict with India, Vietnam, and the Soviet Union. After Mao died, the policy of exporting revolutions became something of an embarrassment to the CCP, and the country instead adopted a policy of minimal interference in foreign affairs and an emphasis on stability at all costs. This was most evident when civil war broke out in Nepal in 1996, after bands of revolutionary Maoists rose up against the corrupt Nepalese royal family. Rather than supporting the Maoist rebels, China instead condemned them for misusing the chairman's good name, and even supplied the Nepalese government with weapons in 2005 to suppress them. which seemed to prove that Maoism in China had been supplanted by a much more pragmatic ideology. But such carefulness didn't stop China from sometimes lashing out in nationalist rage. In 1996, angered by Taiwan's first democratic elections, the Chinese military fired dozens of missiles into the Taiwan Straits, hoping to intimidate the newest Asian democracy. The United States responded by sending its navy to accompany the Taiwan fleet and forced the missiles to stop. This incident was an embarrassment for China and forced it to acknowledge that it couldn't stop the US military from aiding Taiwan. During the 2000s, China's policy became one of mostly using international institutions like the United Nations to safeguard its financial investments, many of which were in Africa. Unlike Western powers, China had no qualms about dealing with any dictators that they found in Africa, and were happy to pursue investments in Zimbabwe, Angola and Sudan. As part of this strategy, China vastly increased its military contribution in the United Nations, and specifically sent them to combat rebels in Sudan and to police pirate operations near Somalia. Rather than waste time with things like ceasefires and human rights concerns, China was always eager for any rebels to be quickly crushed, lest they disrupt investment opportunities. However, China was still willing to use covert tactics to play global power games. They supported the NATO intervention in Afghanistan, for example, but were later found arming the Taliban in 2007. The same dynamic of stability first played out in Sri Lanka in 2009, where after years of ceasefires, the impatient Chinese pressured their ally Pakistan to supply the government with weapons that they needed to finally wipe out the Tamil Tigers and put an end to that conflict. This more careful and stability-oriented approach would change in the 2010s after Xi came into power, and once China grew in confidence about its relative strength. So it's under Xi's tenureship that the country would change from being a quiet goods manufacturer to the world's biggest authoritarian influencer. In the early 2010s at first, the CCP by and large keeps to its principle of keeping a low profile and maintaining stability. The government refused to intervene when a coup in neighbouring Kyrgyzstan threatened regional stability and overthrew the government. They also pledged Chinese troops to support the French during the 2012 invasion of Mali to protect their investments there. But just as Xi was assuming office, however, this non-interference policy soon begins to be put under increasing strain, especially in the South China Sea. In 2012, China effectively annexed the Scarborough Shoal Islands from the Philippines by first occupying it with militarised fishing vessels and then refusing to comply with a UN-mandated withdrawal, despite international courts ruling against them. Later in the same year, the Japanese government's decision to purchase the Senkaku Islands from its private owner triggered mass protests all over China that included the wrecking of Japanese cars, Japanese stores, and violence against Japanese nationals. The government responded by attempting to establish air dominance over the islands, but this didn't lead to very much. Other signs that the avoiding the limelight days were nearing an end came from reports that China sent its special forces into Syria in 2015 to combat Uyghurs who were fighting alongside the Syrian rebels. This period also saw increasing cooperation between China and Iran. China had helped Iran develop its nuclear program in the 1990s and became its largest trading partner in the 2000s. A 2016 US subpoena alleged that Huawei had been using proxy companies to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars into Iran, violating US sanctions, and also deliver stolen technology to Iran, North Korea and Syria. Further excursions would soon follow. PLA armed and trained militia groups during the Rohingya conflict in Myanmar in 2017, and in the same year it gave millions of dollars worth of weapons freely to the Philippines to crack down on the insurgency in Marawi. All of which seemed to point to Beijing becoming less and less shy about using military power to secure its interests. All of this was partially a build-up to Xi Jinping's takeover of the party in 2018. His new policies involved making China a world leader in key industries like energy, biotech and AI, but this also included a military strategic dimension. The Belt and Road Initiative and Huawei's 5G rollout were part of a new strategy to use China's massive resources to make it a global standard in key industries. China's foreign minister in 1999 had stated that only when China was strong would they have the power to back our words with actions. And in 2018, in Xi Jinping's opinion, this time had now clearly arrived. Xi's party takeover was not just part of a strategy to get political control of the party, but it also involved exporting China's political system using technology specifically designed for dictatorships. To see the system that China is now spreading around the world, you only need to look at the neighbouring countries that fall within its sphere of influence. Central Asia is becoming a model for a global Chinese-style authoritarianism, as the technologies and policies that were used on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang are being exported there. As well as the social credit system, which is used to target people who exhibit antisocial behaviour or political dissidents, the CCP has rolled out its AI-driven surveillance program that links tens of millions of CCTV cameras across China with footage from smartphones and smart TVs, and it's known as the Sharp Eyes program. It coordinates data from online messaging, GPS data, purchasing history, and filters it all with AI recognition software. China is currently seeking to export its social credit system to Kazakhstan by next year, and it's already installed Huawei surveillance technology in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, which the Huawei representative in Uzbekistan said was a prerequisite for Chinese investment. This technology has also accompanied increasing arms sales to Central Asian countries and donations of militarized police equipment. The same surveillance technology was also sold to Ethiopia and Zimbabwe under the umbrella of Belt and Road, and last year Huawei engineers helped the Ugandan government hack WhatsApp to arrest opposition leaders in Uganda. But China's influence in Africa extends far beyond sales of technology. Officials there routinely use bribes and intimidation to secure business contracts, even on, for example, the president of Chad. The Chinese government was found spying on the African Union headquarters in Ethiopia and has recently pledged to fund the African Standby Force to the tune of $100 million. But there are other worrying signs that the CCP is willing to go beyond financial leverage in Africa. Before the coup in Zimbabwe that ousted Robert Mugabe, his vice president, Mnangagwa, fled to China in November 2017. There he met with several Chinese military officials and then returned to Zimbabwe and took over the government using several Chinese military vehicles that no one had seen before. This spread considerable alarm about China's involvement in the coup, as China had previously criticised Mugabe because of his nationalisation of Chinese-owned diamond mines. China is also extending its influence in South America. They've supplied surveillance technology to the government in Ecuador and are currently propping up the Maduro dictatorship in Venezuela with funding and technological assistance. In total, 18 countries are known to be using Chinese facial recognition AI, with many more suspected to be developing it. The true extent of China's political manipulation was seen in 2018, when it gathered signatures from 37 countries to support its policy of incarcerating more than 1 million peaceful Muslims in Xinjiang. Most of the countries supporting China were themselves dictatorships, and tellingly, almost all had previously signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. Only Turkey and Malaysia later broke ranks and criticised China after it used its influence to extradite ethnic Uyghurs from countries as far away as Egypt. Here, the Prime Minister of Pakistan openly replies, when asked about his country's support by a Turkish journalist, that he's unable to challenge China because of the amount of economic support that they've lent his country.
China has been a great friend to Pakistan. China has helped us in our most difficult time again because of the crisis we inherited, the economic crisis. So the way we deal with China is that when we talk about things, we talk about privately. We do not talk about things with China in public right now because they're very sensitive. That's how they deal with issues.
So one has to at least give him credit for being honest. Both governments have since acknowledged that the Pakistan Economic Corridor, part of the Belt and Road, will be used to refuel Chinese fighter jets. But Pakistan is just one example of China's new military ambitions. After Xi Jinping's power play, the country built 7 militarised artificial islands in the South China Sea, opened a military base in Djibouti, and has since been found building military bases in Cambodia, Pakistan, Myanmar, Afghanistan and Tajikistan, with several more commercial ports being considered. If one wants to find a model for a modern Chinese satellite state, one needs look no further than Cambodia, a country which now resembles something akin to a tributary state of an ancient Chinese dynasty. The story of how the CCP came to own Cambodia is an interesting one. Hun Sen, the country's present leader, lost the 1993 national election, but was allowed to become Prime Minister as part of a coalition government. In 1996, he was invited to Beijing, where he was given political support and Chinese funding, then returned to his country and effectively forced out the other majority party and took over the government with Chinese money. Since then, Cambodia has remained a puppet state of China, repeatedly blocking ASEAN condemnations of their behaviour in the South China Sea, and receiving $5.3 billion in funding from the Chinese government in the last 5 years. In 2018, the Cambodian government completely outlawed its opposition party, and with the help of Chinese cyber attacks, placed almost all of its leaders in prison. When the coronavirus first broke out in China, Hun Sen immediately flew to visit Xi Jinping and declared that Cambodians would not wear masks as they had nothing to fear from the virus, and that his country's borders would remain completely open. Cambodia is therefore the model for what China would like to create for every country in the world. An authoritarian dictatorship that imprisons dissidents and serves Chinese business and political interests. The strategy is essentially to offer developing countries a way to rapidly grow their economies based on cheap loans and infrastructure, and to offer the ruling autocrats protection in the form of financial backing and advanced technology. In return, the CCP demands silence over their human rights abuses, support for Chinese business interests, and non-alliance with democratic nations. This strategy, however, can only appeal to autocratic countries with very corrupt political institutions, whose interest is primarily in expanding their power base and not representing their citizens. Recent events have shown that it's much more difficult for China to influence countries where well-functioning democratic systems are already in place. And so the strategy developed towards developed countries is instead one of espionage, financial pressure, and soft power. China's political subversion campaigns in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Australia were revealed last year by the Chinese spy Wang Liqiang, who defected to the Australian government in November last year. There have also been reports of massive bribery campaigns directed towards politicians in Germany, but these global campaigns have not been very successful, as recent elections in Hong Kong and Taiwan have gone appallingly for the CCP. Elsewhere, the Chinese government routinely uses espionage to steal Western technology, and then uses it to aid their authoritarian politics. Recent reports from the US and the UK warned of a global Chinese cyber warfare campaign, targeted at least 45 companies and over 100,000 individuals. Most people have heard of China's Great Firewall, which is a euphemism for a giant government project that censors thousands of foreign websites from Chinese citizens. But what's less known about is a project called the Great Cannon, which is a Chinese government offensive cyber weapon, which is used to take down foreign websites that are critical of the Chinese government's policies. Many Chinese students and scientists have also been employed by their government to steal Western technology and export it back to China, which has led to dozens of nationals being arrested over the last couple of years. But as alarming as these subversion campaigns are, what is arguably of more concern is the amount of financial leverage that China is able to exercise over Western companies. Massive corporations like Mercedes, Apple, and Nike have been forced to censor symbols or slogans considered to be politically sensitive in China, like Taiwan and Tibet, and Hollywood movies are increasingly forced to do likewise. But perhaps most worrying of all is the creation of a new axis of authoritarian powers that are aligned against democratic nations, primarily between China, Russia, and Iran, who've been deepening economic and financial ties for some time now. In 2019, the three of them held their first joint military exercises in the Gulf of Oman, in response to growing tensions between Iran and the US. China's joint military operations with other countries have increased in the dozens over the last couple of years, and forced the Philippines to say that it will no longer conduct military operations with the United States for fear of offending their Asian neighbour. But despite the unprecedented threat that's presented by these actions, it's also important to acknowledge the limitations of China's strategy. Because even before the coronavirus, in the last year alone, Xi has seen many mounting challenges to his grand plan. Even before the coronavirus broke out, the Chinese economy was reportedly in much worse condition than the government reported, meaning that Xi's state investments are rather limited. His planned Belt and Road projects have only really just gotten started. Corruption in authoritarian countries means that investors have a very difficult time making money there. And actually in countries like Angola, Venezuela, even Nicaragua, the Chinese government has lost incredible amounts of money pursuing these projects. So his attempted expansion of Chinese political influence in the world has accompanied a propaganda effort, including increased advertisements in Western newspapers, training journalists in Latin America and Africa in Chinese propaganda, and promoting Chinese soft power using tools like the Confucius Institute. However, all in all, these operations have not been very successful, as public opinion of China has plummeted because of their recent actions on the world stage. The economic decoupling of Western economies from China will be accelerated because of the virus, but it's important to recognise that the main threat that the world faces from China is not economic, but ideological. The country has created a sphere of influence based on authoritarian economic development, and will expand it given the chance. As Xi Jinping finds himself implicated in the biggest man-made disaster in modern history, it might be dawning on him that his grand political strategy has run out of steam before it really got started. Whenever the man himself smiles, he still often manages to look very dissatisfied. And the moment when he placed his own vote to make himself president for life was one of the few times when he looked genuinely happy. Now that same Congress is closed, even as China pretends to the world that it's open for business. And instead of sitting in a room full of cheering subordinates, he's now pictured alone on a chair outdoors. He's been relegated to the background, appearing only a few times during the corona crisis, that is almost entirely of his own making. And one can't help think, when comparing him to his height of power in 2018, that his political triumph has receded almost as quickly as it emerged. The next few years will decide whether Xi and his strand of politics is able to survive the political turmoil that's now engulfing China, and whether this new nationalist and confrontational approach is here to stay or is just a passing political phenomenon. Thank you for listening, and if you want to read more about our coverage on China and other topics, you can read our news site roughestimate.org. Thank you.